Thank you all so much. Last panel of the day officially, yes? All right. And it's going to be a fun one, I promise. Okay. So, as AI continues to shape our world, we really need to be asking, who's being included in these important decision-making conversations and who's being left out? Because we know that not everyone is being served in the same ways by the technology that's being developed and how it's being deployed. So, and we know that inclusive AI policies not only are essential for making sure that we have equitable outcomes, but at the end of the day, they produce better services, products, and technology. Like having more people involved in that process, giving their insights, ensures that we have things that just work more effectively. Our panel today, Prioritizing People in the Age of AI, brings together insights from our Global Task Force for Inclusive AI that was brought together formally last June. And it's a diverse group of people that have collaborated across borders and different sectors. Each individual actually comes with years of experience working across sectors as well. So even though some of them sit in particular companies and organizations now, they've actually worked across the AI field for many years on this topic of stakeholder engagement, community involvement, inclusive AI. And we worked for the past year. So this panel is a little unique in that we've actually been in conversation with each other quite frequently. And so it's actually very nice to be able to bring that conversation out into the public. But as I said, we've been working for the past year to actually develop recommendations, which are out now for public comment. And there will be a QR code at the end of our panel because your input is incredibly important to this process. But the guidelines are really about trying to get into the details and nuances of what does it mean to actually work with stakeholders in a way that is non-extractive, that really centers their needs as different communities to really think about these really important questions in AI. And we want to make sure that, as folks are thinking about this, especially in the commercial sector, they're thinking about the kinds of benefits that they can bring to communities, not at the end of the process, but entirely, like throughout that entire process, right, in the relationship building that they do. So we're going to dive into those conversations around how we can create different AI policies that really genuinely prioritize people, and thinking really about some of the opportunities and challenges that come up. Because I think, and all of us will say that working with stakeholders, especially those that come from socially marginalized communities, those who have always been excluded historically and contemporaneously, like in the process, it's really challenging. It's really difficult to make sure that we are uplifting them in a way that matters to them. So, very quickly, so we have enough time for questions, if each of you could go down and just introduce yourself in terms of what's your name and where are you working, what's your role? So I'll start with Lauren.
Great, thanks Tina. So I'm Lauren Wilcox, and I joined eBay last year to build their Office of Responsible AI. In that role, I broadly look at ways that the company can adopt the state of the art in both our technology development governance as well as how we make decisions at multiple levels, engage in training, education, think about policies for the company, et cetera, and interface with groups like Partnership on AI. Before joining eBay, I was a group manager of a team called TASK, Technology, AI, Society, and Culture in Google Research. And this was a really unique team that was multidisciplinary, specifically put together in a multidisciplinary way in order to examine and shape the socio-technical processes that underlie and kind of surround AI and machine learning development, and really bring key aspects around kind of cultural inclusivity and equity, intersectional equity-oriented perspectives to machine learning development and evaluation. And so as part of that work, we were very interested in ways of bringing participatory approaches to machine learning model development and evaluation. And it's pretty tricky to do in industry. Things at eBay, for example, are still ramping up. We're doing workshops just with leaders just to even socialize the importance of why we need to engage with our customers even more, and not necessarily just in sort of a UX research perspective, although we certainly need to also strengthen that work, but as a direct part of how we shape policies and processes and evaluate our technology.
Thank you. Wilneida?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Wilneida Negrón. I'm the Director of Research and Policy at Coworker. And a lot of the work that I do is really dealing with the question of technology, but within the real life market and industrial contexts that those issues emerge for workers in their day-to-day work. And unionization and capacity building was brought up in the fireside chat before. A lot of the workers that we work with, I think unions cover about 11 or 12% of the workforce in the US. That means there's 80% or more of workers that are not represented and don't have an easy pathway to build capacity on these issues. So a lot of the work is really, really deep, kind of bottom-up engagement with workers and contextualizing the rapid technological changes within the industrial relationships with employers, with the vendors, with the startups that are making that technology. And it's a really interesting dynamic to navigate, and we'll share some insights of what it's like to guide workers through those kinds of realities as they're thinking about the future of work.
So, hi everyone. My name is Adriana Alvarado. I'm a research scientist at IBM Research, and I'm part of a team that it's fairly new still. We have been like 3 years, and the team is about how to develop responsible technologies. And as part of our work, we're very focused on developing different kinds of methods and frameworks to better understand how to make different kinds of interventions to ensure that the technologies that we produce are more responsible. And as Tina mentioned before, in the past, actually my work was more in nonprofit organizations, specifically in Mexico, my home country. And I was very focused on working with grassroots organizations around how to use technology to address human rights violations.
Thank you. So I would love for each of you, maybe just to start very briefly with this question of, how can policymakers and tech companies ethically engage stakeholders on all different kinds of AI issues? Just solve the entirety of the problem in a few sentences.
I'll start.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, so this will be a plug for the guidelines that Tina had a huge role in leading the development of and kind of guiding our task force toward publishing. But I think those draft guidelines are really, the aim is to situate for people, given their unique circumstances, what are best practices and what are some guardrails that should be that we should be thinking about when we apply these practices. So everything from how we identify communities to engage with, what is that process of who gets to define who the community is and how they participate, what values are shaping that stakeholder or partner engagement, all the way through to how do we think about communication, transparency, accountability as partners. I think that all of this is really, I think, mapped out really well with some case studies. So I'll just use that opportunity to plug the guidelines. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think with AI, we have a unique opportunity to try to get some things right in the social infrastructure of society, meaning that we have an opportunity to invest in true engagement, and that is not a lot of what those conversations involve are not AI related. They're about investing in digital literacy. They're about investing in historically marginalized communities, building new vehicles of accountability and enforcement and monitoring from local government to national. It's about learning how to be a democracy, which we're not doing a very good job right now. And then, once we can get the bones of social civic infrastructure in place, I think a lot of the guidelines, I think they're good, and they can be sort of the trade question came up, I think, from Catherine. I think, a lot of what could happen is a lot of these guidelines can serve as the beginning of standards that can be incorporated through trade policy or even like in an industry around labor standards. but ultimately, the people that give life and accountability to those guidelines are going to be your street level bureaucrats, which is our communities and workers that are going to hold companies accountable. And so I think in a dream world, I would love to see a greater investment in the bottom up work rather than the continuation of the top down, which like sets the table, sets the agenda, that then gets enforced with the technology on communities and workers. And so I think the window for that flipping or that evening out is closing a bit, but that's sort of what I would put in there. I don't know what you would add.
I think just in general, there are different kinds of participation. So I think that's precisely one of the challenges, that we need to understand that there is not one single solution. There is a spectrum of modes of participation, and there has been some scholarship and, for example, some work from data and society, work from academia that precisely provides a set of categories on these different kinds of modes of participation. And it goes from seeing or approaching communities or stakeholders as like consulting them, to all the way to actually having these communities being the owners of the projects. And I think whenever we talk about like how do we engage stakeholders, we need to understand that depending on the mode of participation that we choose, we researchers, practitioners, institutions, there are going to be consequences. One of the consequences, for example, for stakeholders and communities is that they are going to have different levels of agency, and there are going to be different benefits for them. And for us as researchers or institutions, we need to think that we're going to have a different kind of insight, and we are going to have also to think about the different relationships with those communities. And just to give a very quick example, yeah. It's very different that we engage with people just for user experience or to improve a system, versus actually think about participatory design methods to give them the agency to provide input and actually decide whether a system should be or not deployed in their communities. Like, those are different things. So whenever we think about how we approach, I think we need to reflect on that, like, what is our context? And I think precisely the guidelines provide that, right? Like, it's a framework that tries to support practitioners into reflect on what are the conditions of the work that they want to do, and try to think on that before incorporating actually input from stakeholders. And based on that, think about what is the most appropriate mode of participation.
Yeah. And I think it's a really important point to make that, like, stakeholder engagement is not in any way a new concept, and we're really building from the insights of a lot of other sectors. I think the important thing for AI is that it is this opportunity and a paradigm shifting moment that the stakes of getting this wrong are very, very high, and so we should use this as an opportunity to rethink, like you're saying, the civic and social infrastructure that can actually help support a different kind of stakeholder engagement from those lessons that we've learned over the decades and hundreds of years of really trying to figure out, like, how do we build together as a society and make sure that no one gets left behind. And so thank you all for,
add to that, the capacity is not that challenging. I've had, and for anybody who's engaged communities, I have gone into Kansas, Atlanta, into community meetings where with teachers, bus drivers, they've never heard of AI, and have just given them, a sheet with, like, this is what different technologies that are utilizing AI in different ways, this is how it's showing up, and then just backing off completely and letting them talk among themselves. And again, this is like the domain expertise of the real life world experience is so incredibly rich that I would much rather do a policy or guidelines with the content, with the insights that come out of those conversations than with experts, to be honest with you. And that's why I've shifted my whole work to working outside of the expert arena, because when you give I don't think they need a lot of technical, but I think there's a space for the technical expertise, but the domain and sort of the policy and the guidelines and the conversations is very intuitive. Like workers can understand how, communities can understand like what's at stake, and just like by one simple handout. And so I think it's like, to whatever extent that we can realize it's not, that challenging, it's actually incredibly accessible. But at the same time, because of our work that we've done all year, like, you don't want the floodgates to open for community engagement to just be done without careful, because I'm sort of saying like, no, engage communities, and then now at the same time, like that can be extractive. So it's like, how do you balance that?
I'm going to want to come back to that, but I do want to turn over to Lauren, because you have been trying to, I feel like you've been spending a lot of years of your life really at that intersection of like, how do we do this work well, from a company corporate context, mindful of all those things. And I know that you've also worked really closely with folks and done that stakeholder engagement work. And so, how do you incorporate those kinds of participation policies within these kinds of frameworks?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and I think that we also need new frameworks. So there's existing frameworks that we can work within, right? Like participatory action research or participatory design, and I think, for me, kind of also doing a bunch of research at Google in the health informatics space. There was a really kind of cool emergence in the 90s to the early 2000s of community-based participatory research that sort of infused health work that we were really inspired by. But one of the things that has already come up in the panel is like treating local experts as experts, right? And kind of coming to communities rather than expecting that we just sort of extrapolate knowledge from them. Tina, you talked about infrastructure. I think it's a really important point, because we're developing infrastructure right now, but I would argue that it's probably a little bit too oriented toward digital spaces where the creators of those spaces are defining what it means to be a community, focusing on things like consensus, which has its place, but we also need to hold space for dissensus and contestability. And when the goal becomes making a deliberative democratic process quick, or which essentially becomes polling, that's more amenable to quantitative methods, but it doesn't necessarily represent authentic needs of a community. And so I think being mindful of those things, because it's really easy to apply the same tools that we've applied for other problem solving to quote unquote community engagement, and we'll fail if we do that. So I think showing up, building trust, relationship building, all the things outlined in the guidelines around what it means to be also really clear-eyed about what it takes to do this work, the sponsorship involved, alignment at, if this is approached from a company, really having buy-in at all levels. The worst thing that can happen is like, funding is pulled, oops, budgets are zeroed out, it's quarter four, sorry, and you haven't paid your community partners.
Yeah.
And that's a really difficult position to put them in, and also researchers or developers who are partnering. So I think all of these things, and I know that Adriana and Wilneida, you also have experience with these, so would love to hear your thoughts too. Yeah.
Go ahead.
I may take it some other place. But.
No, I think yes, I couldn't agree more. I think that it sounds easy, right? Like it sounds obvious, right? Like yes, we need to build trust, we need to build relationship, but I think sometimes we don't fully realize that all that takes time, and it's not going to scale. It's not going to be so fast as other things that we might be able to do with technology. So I think always navigating those tensions is just a challenge. But again, I think precisely the guidelines is a way to start not to start because there is a lot outside, but to actually operationalize that at different levels.
Yeah, I'm just going to bring it back to the bones of society, in this sense, the economic bones. And and I think I brought this up in a previous policy, but I think, you know, a lot people that might be in this room are in bigger tech companies, and I think we need to look at who is doing the AI development, and it is not the big tech companies. The big tech companies are scooping up the startups that are really driving. And I'm going to plug Catherine's book that's coming out soon. That's going to talk about the economic driver of the role of venture capital, who is driving technology innovation and AI development in this space. It is, I don't know, is there anybody from a startup here? Oh, yay. Amazing too. Okay. We need to talk about governance in the slowing down to do this work. Like, I think corporate America can finagle some slowing down. I think when you think about slowing down, who's driving the innovation right now, that is a much deeper question. Mm-hmm. And that goes into the bones of the economy, into the way private capital works, into the lack of governance in startups, in the lack of capital for founders that want to build slowly with a multi-stakeholder approach, with really thinking about risk. Like, how do we build that parallel economy? Because we need that. I would say right now, I would collaborate with IBM and any other large company, but right now, like, the work that needs to happen is in the startup space. And so how do we put democratic control over really the driver of AI innovation in this moment?
And I think especially for policy questions, that's always been a really big challenge, right? How do you not stop innovation for the sake of like some of these really big ethical questions? And oftentimes we see smaller companies, get exclusions so that they don't feel overburdened by some of these responsibilities and still get the chance to experiment. But to your point, when it comes to AI, there's a lot of movement that's happening in these smaller companies. And so how do we grapple with both of those things, I think is an important thing for us to keep in mind, especially given it's a policy forum and the ecosystem for this space is actually very vast and sort of hyper differentiated. So I want to actually come back to the other point that you're making, though, Wilneida, about sort of the extractiveness, and would love to hear your thoughts sort of on both sort of, what are the best practices for this kind of community engagement, especially be the kinds of historically marginalized and underserved communities that I know that you've been working very closely with, to be really mindful of that kind of extractive nature of how we can operate, and what would that look like reflected in global policy? That's for you. That's you.
For me?
Oh, yeah.
In the startup context?
No, just in general.
Yeah. I think, going back, investing in communities and investing in the digital literacy that's needed, the digital capacity, and not always from an upskilling perspective, because I feel that conversation is getting a little bit stale, to be honest with you, because it feels very standard, and it doesn't capture the imagination or the full agency that workers want to have right now. Like, workers want to be able to audit the algorithms that are coming in. They have questions about those. They have questions about creating curriculum to educate their workers in their industry. They have policy proposals that are unlike anything that I've seen in a national space, at least. And so I think really thinking about what does investment in the local look like to kind of capture the full spectrum of ideas that are happening right now when you give people a chance. Mm-hmm.
I know that probably some of the most exciting work that I've been seeing is actually happening at this like very municipal level. And so like City of San Jose in California has been doing some really interesting work around exploring these questions around like what kinds of AI to be procuring, but they're doing it I know that they worked with one of our partners, Data Society, to really explore this question before they actually did the procurement, and actually learning from different community members and being really mindful of who can't show up to a town hall meeting that needs to really be part of this question around what the city decides to buy. I think City of Portland has been doing some really interesting work around how they work with community members to get them first informed about what the technology is, and then getting their input, and so setting some longer timelines around this. I think our other partner, Ada Lovelace Institute, has done some really interesting work around the Biometrics Council. And again, there's some stuff that's happening all over the world, but at these very small scales that I think are sometimes worth learning from, because some of these smaller municipal governments they have to work with their communities very closely to get this right, because they will hear back very directly if they get it wrong. I think that close proximity really helps, but I wonder what those lessons are for us, to scale it up to a global level. I'm not sure if any of you want to jump in, but sorry, I'm pontificating as we speak, as happens.
Well, I'm really excited about those projects, and it'll give us an opportunity to have case studies with outcomes that we can draw on, right? Because I think it's really important to have these outcomes to point to the importance of how we reach the outcomes, right? The way that we approach these types of projects will determine what the outcomes are, and so to be able to kind of make that mapping really clear is really exciting.
Yes, I think one of the, now that you mentioned about this, Tina, when you mentioned about the scale, this is being done in a very municipal level or local level. I think that's precisely related to the point that I was making before, that these kind of practices are not going to be necessarily easily to scale, because something as basic in participation as who actually can attend, and if there are people who cannot attend, what kind of things we can do to make them, to help them to be there. So having all these nitty-gritty things about actually operationalize participation, I think is incredibly important.
I know one of the things that we're talking about within the task force, and this is an aside for all of you, was just this idea of there are these little pockets of information available, but they're kind of hard to find, and wouldn't it be great if we could have all of those insights about all these different communities actually collated together for once, instead of having them sort of scattershot across the vastness of the internet. And I know that's one of the sort of wishful resources that we would love to see come into fruition, because I think one of the recommendations we make is hey, practitioners, AI developers, do your desk research beforehand, learn about the community, because there have been a ton of social scientists and community-based organizations who have written up all of their findings. It's there for you. It might be a little bit difficult to find sometimes, but you actually have a starting point. You don't have to start from scratch. And so if anyone in the audience wants to pick up that mantle or work with me to do it, please let me know. Last question I want to pose to you, Adriana, which is very similar to the one that I posed to Wilneida, but just much more explicitly, which is, how do you make sure that this process is participatory and not extractive?
Yes, I think we need to spend the time and also to have the commitment, not only say it, but actually have the commitment to build balanced relationships with the communities. And when I say balance, and we already talked a little bit about that in the panel, one of the things is recognize that there is expertise on the communities, even value and recognize that there are insights and experiences from those groups of people that have been already negatively impacted by AI systems. But I think two other practical ways to try to avoid being extractive is, one is that be very explicit about the goals of participation and be willing to change those goals based on the input of the communities. And the second thing is to be willing to actually take the feedback and any other, any other response from the communities and actually be willing to change the technologies or to determine with them whether that should be or not deployed. So when I talk about building balanced relationships, it's actually not just from one side, but actually do something and make the infrastructure, have the training, or have the people that needs to be there to actually take into account what the communities wants to say. So basically, it's like a distribution of power, really. Yeah. Otherwise, it's going to be very difficult or impossible, to be honest. So.
Oh, and make sure that you all have.
Yeah, no, I think there's a place for legal frameworks at the local. I think enforcing transparency helps to equal because in those relationships, like communities might not be getting the full information. It is a one-directional. The information asymmetry. You have a corporate company or a tech company that has a lot of incentives to not, NDAs and lots of things to not disclose the full picture. And so I think to what extent that governments can enforce transparency, that there is enforcement, that our bureaucracies are well invested in doing the investigations that are going to be needed to enforce whatever concerns communities may raise. If it feels like a company is going to run away with a product, even though they did stakeholder engagement and it could be harmful, like what is the enforcement mechanisms? I think I watched Margaret Mitchell's testimony this week, which was really excellent. Everybody should watch that. Is under 5 minutes. And one of the things that she mentioned there was also requiring, the transparency piece, but also the protecting whistleblower. So strengthening whistleblower protections. I think, the enforcement, the transparency piece helps with the information asymmetry, but the enforcement and accountability is going to be needed. And to what extent that we can, what's the work that needs to be done, both to strengthen our weakened bureaucracies at the federal and state and local levels and international, because I think the UN budget has been struggling the past 5 years or 10. Yeah, we need to invest in our institutions. And again, those are political arguments that need to be made to taxpayers. And so again, like the conversation has to be brought, you have to go up the ladders of abstraction up and down, because you have to make the argument to people to invest in these things. And then you have to go into these layers and do the work to promote enforcement. Yeah.
I think one of the things that I find really interesting about kind of methods, right, and how we're engaging communities and stakeholders is that even when we can think about things more transactionally, like there are several cases where a community might say, okay, sure, we'll give you feedback on this research instrument. This is our cost, right? And the company pays the cost. And there can be some forms of transactional, partnerships like that. But even in those cases, that we're doing it wrong in a lot of ways. Like we have some work coming out at AIES that my colleague Mohammed Tahai led that did a big systematic review of surveys of the public for AI input. And everything from the design to the deployment to transparency in reporting was really very biased and kind of centered on the West. So how ethics concepts were positioned in these surveys is very consequentialist, like benefits versus risks. And wasn't a lot of attention paid, right, to sort of working, to getting community input, right, when they were deployed, or even what the deployment strategies were. So I think there's just even some basic work to do that acknowledges that community perspectives can be helpful even in these smaller projects where it's really, even just developing one instrument, which can really have mutual benefit, right, if done well.
Yeah.
But they're just so skewed right now. So I think even taking those small steps is a concrete thing that we can do.
Yeah. I think we're coming right at the time for questions. I think I'm getting a 2, so we have time for 2 questions.
Slightly philosophical question. This kind of dichotomical binary between innovation and public good, and I wonder if innovation is sometimes overvalued in the context of public good. That, like, we need to, and this is also in the context of like thinking about investing in AI, thinking about public-private partnerships, where we're saying that that's potentially a good model for commercing AI investments, and if you're funding using public money to invest in AI, and think about it as an innovation investment, and think that there will be 10 things that we invest in, and one AI product is going to be for public good. Is that really a sort of valuable philosophical model for us to use as we move forward in this question of AI?
I mean, I can get that started.
Yes.
Yeah, no, I think we need a new way to fund innovation in this country, because the incentives of the model chases high returns, and venture is a popular asset class for promising high returns on portfolios. And so lots of investors, institutional investors, are going to put money in that asset class, especially now with the AI hype that's happening, and that is going to undermine the public good. That's going to take a lot more. It's possible, because I work in that space as well, like helping the venture capital development align to whatever extent, because those founders, like, they have seen Facebook, they have seen Mark Zuckerberg, they have seen the big social media, and there's a good number of them that want to build differently, but they can't grow they can't do they're eating ramen noodles, and if VC promises you a few million dollars for your company, you're not going to deny that, and then that puts you in that engine where then they are stuck trying to figure out, how do I think about making my product a public good? Well, I need to make shortcuts and make sure I have a high valuation, et cetera. And so I think we need an alternative fund. I think if the landscape in the US looks different next year, there's an opportunity to think about that much deeper. That is really timely and interesting. But it's possible to have public good and innovation within the current context, but in reality, we may need a different way to fund innovation so that the compromises are not as drastic to overcome between the tensions of both. I don't know what you think of that. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I agree. I mean, I think part of it is the framing, right? That there's a lot of framing of things being in the public interest that aren't, frankly. And so whatever we can do also to boost accountability when things really aren't necessarily in the public interest, but that's the slogan, right?
Mm-hmm. But I do think there's something core to your question, right? Which is like, why do we keep positioning it as this binary? And is that the most useful frame? And I appreciate that you brought that up, because I think the point is that no, it doesn't have to be, because being in public service, being in the public interest is not an argument against innovation. Saying no to certain technologies in the way that they are rolled out is not a mark against innovation. But simultaneously, like, we need to think about the ways in which, like, promoting public interest actually is the way to get to innovation. So thank you so much for that comment and question.
And also just, yeah, the geopolitical realities are also really complicated. So yeah, the incentives for governments to follow the hype are pretty high because of the global dynamics. But
yeah.
Do we have time for one more question, or one more? Okay, one more.
Hi. Well, lastly, I'm a professor of computer science in Switzerland, and I'm wondering if there is a technological solution to broader public participation and also education. So if you could dream up of like an app or some sort of vehicle for people to participate more in that conversation and also to be able to educate themselves about all of these aspects, what would it entail?
I can start. I think it would be how communities who are engaging with companies for the first time, what questions would be useful for them to ask to help them navigate how to keep that company accountable to them, and the project aligned with what's mutually beneficial, and sort of how they should be vetting these engagements, what they, how they should be structuring conversations, thinking about requirements, right, as companies approach them, so that they're actually maximizing the benefit that they would get from these.
I think, in terms of education, I think something that, at least in my experience, that was very insightful is like what happens after the intervention of researchers or institutions. How is the community being left after the intervention? And I think learning about that can be also very insightful. Because yes, oftentimes we're trained sometimes to do something, to go do something, gather, I don't know, information, knowledge, but then what happens with those communities after the fact?
Yeah. I think one of the big things is that technology has the opportunity to allow for greater information exchange, and hopefully with greater information exchange, there's also some leveling of power and awareness and advocacy. And so how do we make sure that the information is accurate? How do we make sure that people actually get access to that information? Because the digital infrastructure right now is also a little bit of a mess worldwide. And then how do you allow for a much more dynamic conversation to happen where there is a lot more give and take, where communities get to speak out and sort of present the questions that they want answered? How can they get more frequent updates back in after projects have ended, and actually understand how their participation in something made some really substantive changes? And so I think those opportunities are there. I think we should also be very wary of how technology might hasten some of the relationship building, because at the end of the day, I think one of the big core points about the guidelines is we want to see more human-to-human contact and learning. Mm-hmm. And that can't be replicated or replaced by AI. And so we are seeing a ton of new tools come out explicitly sort of designed towards improving your user research, experience research, or doing more stakeholder engagement. And one part of the guidelines does sort of outline these are just emerging, so we have lots of questions. Here are the things that we think it could be useful for, because we don't want to deny the utility of these tools. But here are a lot of the questions that we have that might actually, those shortcuts might actually be more harmful to the kinds of processes we want to see happening. And so I think we do need to consider the implications of all of it. The opportunities are ripe, but also we have seen the ways in which that can shortcut and limit access.
Question we didn't really grapple with.
Oh yeah, that's a tough one. But that is all the time we have for this. I think very quickly, we're going to have the QR code for the guidelines up on the screen. It is open for feedback. I love that your phones are going up. It will be up for feedback for the next several months. There is a feedback form. If you are really in this and you're like, hey, my team would love to think through this more with you. The communities that I work with have lots of thoughts and comments. Please reach out directly. Within there, you will see our email address, inclusiveai@partnershiponai.org. But we would love your thoughts and eyes on this. I got to work with 18 exceptional individuals, but we are also just a very small group. And so all of your input will just make this better. But thank you all again for joining us for this panel. Please thank my panelists. Incredible.